Hey there, John.
Howdy, Ryan.
All right, so we are going to continue discussing those 12 leverage points that Donella Meadows laid out. And we're starting with number 12, which she calls it constants, parameters, and numbers. And then in parentheses, subsidies, taxes, standards. I guess those are some like examples of what they could be, right? So ultimately, it seems to me, and this one is to me a little less like obvious or intuitive what she was really even meant here.
Yeah.
But kind of what I got from this that these are just basically like the numbers involved in the system. So, the signals that turn on, which inflows or outflows are going into or out of the system, and turn them on to what level and at what points, like what threshold is it that like those signals turn on. She determines this one as leverage point number 12 being the lowest on the list. And I think she kind of intimates that these are probably the most common things that are tinkered with within a system. And I think she thinks that they're the least valuable leverage points
Yeah,
because
almost a
they can
waste
be
of
pretty.
time, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think largely because, they can be kind of difficult to change, but kind of the read that I got, and I frankly think that her discussion on this was like a little more vague than some of the other ones. Kind of probably because of the nature of what these are, but kind of how I read it is that like basically there's all these numbers and all of these like aspects of the system that you can change, right? So in terms of like if you go back to the bathtub analogy, you got the hot water valve, you got the cold water valve, right? The hot water valve can either you say you can turn it up to 2, or you could turn it all the way up to 4. You could turn it up to a temperature of like 6 units, right? And it's gonna have like some amount of size, right? Maybe it's a 1 centimeter squared, area of the tube coming in, or maybe it's a foot squared area of the tube coming in, right? And there's all those things you can change, right? What's the material of the metal? There are all these different things you can change, and if you intentionally go about changing each individual aspect, basically every single thing you can change is not going to have like a huge gain or a huge change to the system, but it's always going to take a lot of time. So if you're focusing on those individual aspects of the system, the details of the system, the parameters, constants, or numbers, then basically you're going to spend a lot of time making changes that aren't going to have a lot of effect based on the amount of time you're putting in. Does that
Would
kind of
would the way I was thinking about some of this was it feels like more tinkering with like details as opposed to like
right?
really dealing with maybe things that would like fund like she brings up that like whether you have and we're determining this must have been Bush senior, H.W. Bush, or whether you have Bill Clinton in charge, that like how they go about, maybe like how they spend their economic policy, whatever. It's going to be a little different, but they're still fundamentally like operating in the same system. She kind of gives uh, the example of the national debt, that no matter who like gets into Congress or who's in the White House, the annual deficit keeps like increasing. That
Right.
like fundamentally they're not really changing like the problem, I guess, if maybe we wanted to think about that. It's more of just like on the surface level, more like things appear to be moved around, but there isn't really a lot of demonstrative difference between how some of these like policies are really like what their effects, I guess, on the system as a whole.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but then like so I guess my question then is like, if that's the case, what are these numbers, parameters, and constants then, right? It's not Bill Clinton versus Bush, right?
Right.
Like, what is the number, the constant, or the parameter they're changing there? And my assumption is it's more like, well, Clinton gets in, maybe he's maybe his Congress is going to tax more versus the
Yeah.
Bush Congress, and that will change the national debt, right? So if
Yeah.
you get more inflow of money or
Yeah.
then that's going to reduce the size of the debt, right?
Yeah.
However, then if you get in, the next president, let's say Bush Jr., then he's going to change the tax system as well, and then now that just
Yeah.
kind of like creates the system. So if you're just focused on like those specific numbers, they can always be reversed, right? Which is why they aren't very high leverage points,
Yeah.
because they have like they have very limited changes, but they take a lot of effort to make a change like that, right? So it has a small effect, right? Or maybe even a large effect, but it's only affecting one tiny piece of the system. But you put all this effort and all this time and all this discussion to changing that one tiny piece, but there's the whole system itself that if
Right.
you made some changes to the feedback loops or something like that, then you don't need to worry about the details of the numbers.
Well, and part of me is thinking too that like one of the ways to view this top-down list is that the things closer to the top, the less leveragey of the points are probably in some ways like easier to tweak and fuck with. Uh but they don't have like the same kind of lasting impact as things that might take like obviously jumping ahead slightly, but if you're going to change like a goal of the system, that would be like a massive, or feels like it would be a more massive undertaking. But we could also see how come it would have a
Right.
much greater impact if, we shift like, let's just as an example shift from like capitalism to like a Marxism or something like that is obviously going to have a lot more impacts on the system as a whole than tweaking some amount of like tax policy, but still operating within
Right, and that's
a
going
capitalist
to
system.
influence our understanding of what numbers need to be what numbers need
Yeah.
to be tweaked
Yeah.
in what direction, right?
Yeah.
So by doing a meta change like that, you influence a bunch of these lower level changes.
Yeah.
And that's why I think like that's higher, because now that influences a bunch of these detail changes, whereas just focusing on the details means basically like, it's like a sinking ship, like you're plugging all like the little holes, right? But no matter what, I mean, you're going to spend all day plugging the holes and all your materials, and yet the ship's still going to sink, right?
The water is
so
still
you
running
need
in,
to find a lifeboat. You may need to jump off the ship,
Yeah.
or some other analogy that I'm not creative enough to think of. All right,
Yeah.
so yeah. So it's more like when you're focusing on the details, you're putting a lot of time and effort on those details, but there are higher level changes can be made than those details would sort themselves out.
Part of my question or my suspicion here is that, and I think part of perhaps why the tweaking of these things is so like ineffective and so variable is because it can shift every 4 years or maybe even every 2 years if we want to think in terms of like Congress, changing over and things like that. Part of me wonders if these things wouldn't perhaps be greater leverage points if they could be sustained over like a longer period of time than a 4 or 2 year election cycle. That if you, for instance, because then that seems like it could shift more into like a goal change. If like we, for instance, I'm thinking a big one because she mentioned subsidies, right? Like one of the reasons why the oil industry is still being propped up, in the world is, especially in the U.S., is because of the massive subsidies that are given to the oil and gas companies, right?
Right.
That make it artificially easier for them to compete with a market that is increasingly favoring renewables. And maybe if all of those subsidies were pulled en masse from the oil companies, they would no longer perhaps be able to compete effectively just based on market forces ideas with the new renewables and things that are starting to come in that are getting like a lot cheaper. And so while these subsidies, and again, we just saw it again, right, with the transition between Biden now back to Trump. Trump went in and undid a bunch of the things that Biden had started to do to try to like actually subsidize the more green energy stuff and kind of switch things in that direction. And then Trump comes along and then reverses. So a lot of these things, because they're so easy to change, it feels like to me it's difficult for them to have lasting impact because, 4 years later, then they could just all be reversed or sent in a different direction.
Exactly, yeah.
But I'm thinking that like if, for instance, let's take China as an example, that instead of, 4-year type of plans that we kind of end up revolving around, they set more of these like 20-year goals and plans. And if you were to perhaps implement some subsidies or tax policy that was going to be like maintained over like a couple of decades, it feels like that could then actually could potentially have some real impact, right? If you like say pulled subsidies from oil and gas and then put them all into renewables, like over 20 years, that's going to make quite a difference, and it feels like could have quite the impact on the system as a whole. Um,
Right, right. So yeah, so I mean, a couple of thoughts there are that I think she kind of mentions this, that the reason why they're low, and again, she's kind of like vague in talking about this one. I think some part of it is because like it is a little bit vague, and also because she hasn't like built out the other things on top of it just yet at this point in the article. But if you make changes to any of these constant numbers or details of the system, they're going to make changes to other components of the system, right? So one of the higher up ones is, you know, stocks in the system. So like the amount of material stuff that is baked within the system, right? So you can think about one of those stocks or one of those material components of the system being like how many oil companies are there, right? Or their like market share of the energy production, right? And that one small detail of changing the subsidies will over time create a difference in that stock of how many oil companies you have or their market share of energy production, right? So that small leverage point can have other effects on the system at large and on other leverage, other higher up leverage points, right? But the reason why it is not a very effective one is that, just like you said, someone else can change it easily. And because it's only a small detail, it's not really self-reinforcing. So it needs a lot of time to take effect, and it won't like reinforce itself over that period of time. It is susceptible to changes but from the management of the system in a way that perhaps some other leverage points are not, that do reinforce themselves and do make larger changes that are more difficult to reverse. Whereas this is very reversible, right? Again, with the tariffs or with the subsidies, anything like that, you know, the next administration is likely to just reverse it. So it doesn't take much to change them. And that is a power, because then you can do something, right, immediately, and you don't need to spend all this time making large system changes, which are harder to implement. But it is also a weakness because it can then be changed very easily when someone else comes in charge or a new person is managing the system.
And I guess she does say like not the parameters aren't important. They can be, especially in the short term and to the individual standing in the direct flow. But they rarely change behavior, and maybe that's the key distinction.
Right, and that's, I think, when she goes on to say, like, you know, we could change out a Bill Clinton for a George Bush, but really it's the same ideas, the same system, the same behaviors that they're going to be, you know, enacting. And so, you know, obviously there is a difference between them, but how much of a difference? Not really much.
Also, I just to pull something specific that really did blow my mind, because this felt like definitely was talking about stuff that happened after she wrote this article, and in fact after she was already off the scene, but seemed incredibly poignant somehow to me. She says, whatever cap we put on campaign contributions, it doesn't clean up politics. The Fed's fiddling with the interest rate haven't made business cycles go away. We always forget that during upturns and then are shocked by the downturns. And I like that, just like screamed the Great Recession in '08 to me. That like these cycles just keep coming, and we just know they're going to keep coming, but then we're like so surprised when like the bubble bursts or whatever, you know. And it's like, even though we just you know, keep going through like the same things like over and over again, but we don't seem to figure out how to get out of these constant like oscillations up and down.
Right.
And
clearly the interventions we have are not, are not preventing those oscillations from continuing to occur.
Yeah. And then something else she mentioned too, because this is something I've studied a decent amount, but this spending more money on police doesn't make crime go away. I feel like some of this is something we talk about quite a lot, and I think that this article feels like it kind of hints in this direction for sure, is that too perhaps another way to see these this point 12 with constants, parameters, and numbers is that they're more like surface level, or often like maybe like we would term them like band-aid solutions,
Hmm.
Whereas like that's like with the police is like a classic example of that. Like, oh, more crime. We just have to give more money to like people fighting the crime. But like we know from studying criminology for whatever the last 100 and something plus years that we've been doing that like the number one way that you like reduce crime, at least like street crime, like what most people think about, is like getting rid of poverty.
Reduce
Um,
poverty. Yeah.
but that's like obviously one quite it's much easier to give the police a few extra $1 million than to get rid of all of the poverty in
Yeah.
like the country as a whole, right?
And there's probably like an immediate feedback, right? So if you provide more funding to the police, you can hire more police, and you see, look, there's an immediate
Yeah.
consequence of giving more police. Now, obviously, does that immediately reduce crime? And maybe it does, like slightly for some period of time or something like
Yeah.
that. Does it consistently reduce crime? I don't know, but you would then have to track that over time, right? But you can see there is an immediate feedback. Meanwhile, reducing poverty is going to take a lot more time and
An effort.
probably more like systems to put in place,
Yeah.
more effort and funding in order to do. And it's not going to happen immediately, right? It's a much larger problem to solve. And so that might more consistently get you to a reduced crime level, but doesn't have the same signals of something being accomplished as like just hiring more police does.
And I'm gonna again go back to this. To me, strikes me as something that might be fundamentally a difficulty, perhaps even a flaw of democracy. Quite frankly, is this 4 year like election because right, like I can
Yep.
go fund cops and I can immediately then go tell the people voting for me. Again, this is like a perception of reality thing. Oh,
Yep. Yep.
I'm fighting crime. Like I'm tough on crime. Reelect me, right? Whereas like maybe addressing poverty in the system as a whole, maybe that takes like a decade or 2 decades. But I'm not going to be getting elected. I might not even be alive in 2 decades or where some of these politicians are quite old. They're not often thinking, I don't think, in those kind of terms of like actually solving a problem like long term and the most efficient or like ultimately the most efficient manner possible isn't actually their most pressing concern. It's getting reelected in 2 or 4 years. And so I
Mhm.
think that a lot of these things might fall under that too, that they seem like they're easy to change and tweak and mess with, like you said, between administrations, between parties, whatever, but they just don't have that staying power because of the fact that they're not really. I'm almost seeing these things as like they're not really getting at the root causes of like things in the system. We're more like, how do we treat like symptoms and things that will allow us to make our next soundbite to get elected again during the next election cycle.
Right, right, yeah. Yeah, because they're not system change, right? They're not
Yeah.
they're not broad. They are specific and detail oriented, like you were saying. And so, although when we implement them, we might be able to have some signal that something has happened, like with the police, and that changed the perception of the
Yeah.
system. But then that changed perception then turns off the other valves, or turns off our need to shift other valves, right?
Right.
Like other valves that might actually reduce poverty and then
Yeah.
have an actual impact, meaningful impact on crime
Yeah.
rate. Because we saw the increase of police and said, okay, job's done. Let's stop
Yeah.
messing around with things.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah,
Well,
so they
yeah.
have more limited impact and they have short term effects that seem like they're significant impact, but may not really address the intended goals that we're trying to implement.
They also feel to me like simple narratives. Like they, they,
Right.
they
Yep.
appear like more simple solutions. Like, oh, we have a crime problem. All we need to do is just hire more cops.
More
And
cops.
that's
Yep.
like a very easy, like, okay, how much is that going to cost? Oh, $10 million to hire whatever, 10,000 more cops or something. Whatever the
Yep.
numbers like. And so it feels like probably it's like easy definable, like demonstrable. There's like very, oh, well, then we'll just put in this amount of money, we'll get this out, and that will take care of the thing, as opposed to, again, like if you're going to talk about something like how do we fundamentally address like poverty in the system, that's clearly going to take more than just allocating $10 million to some department.
Right.
Like you said, at a minimum, it's probably going to involve several departments are going to have to be,
Right. Right.
funded or whatever. And that obviously is then going to get, orders of magnitude more complicated, the more things that have to change. If you have to overhaul an entire system, obviously that's not a simple fix anymore. And I feel like
Yep.
some of this comes down to like what we are selling to, quite frankly, often very uninformed voters. Because again, with complex problems, they probably require complex solutions that probably require some amount of technical knowledge, some amount of understanding of things, even like statistics, or a
Yeah,
lot
yeah, yeah,
of
yeah.
a lot of like information that, quite frankly, the average voter, at least in the United States, does not appear to be terribly equipped to handle.
Yeah, and then like this was so interesting about the systems thinking because then like the voters are components in the system, so like their level of education or like their access to information, right? Those seem to be like higher leverage points. Those are things you can change as well, and those have feedback components to how other changes to the system are
Yeah.
made. So it's such a cool topic, this whole systems thinking idea.
Yeah, like just investing obviously more in like quality education obviously would be like something that you would do if like your goal was to have a more informed like voter populace. Then you would have, but
Yep.
then again, that also does require, to be quite frank, some amount of tweaking with these parameters and taxes and stuff, right? Because some of that would be about like allocating more money to like education, for instance.
Yeah, yeah.
But then like obviously how is that most
Well,
effectively done and all of that.
yeah. Exactly, and that's why this is so low, right? Because all those details do need to be changed, right? But they can be more intentionally and more permanently changed if you mess with higher level leverage points, right? Like if your goal for the system changes, then what you do with the details is also going to change as a knock-on effect of that, and that's why these
Right.
are low level because they're point changes rather
Yeah.
than broader holistic changes.
Yeah.
So, and they will all be taken care of if you have more self-reinforcing, larger leverage point changes that then
Right.
trickle down to those.
Right. Absolutely.
Cool.
Um
I got one more point. So,
yeah.
the last paragraph before she has some story from the internet.
Uh-huh.
She says that most systems have evolved or are designed to stay far out of critical parameter ranges. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, just I guess that like ultimately maybe short of like getting rid of like taxes like entirely or something like that, like you're not gonna like actually like bring like a whole system down or really like change it to where like by critical I assume she meant more like something drastic
Like system
or
collapse.
yeah, something more like that would like actually occur. And so probably yeah, the tweaking of these things kind of up and down like a little bit isn't going to necessarily, again, unless they're kind of, I guess I'm thinking more of like, again, this is like the more the drag, like if we tomorrow pulled every single subsidy for the oil and gas companies, like that would feel like to me like that might almost be, but again, that's probably like more of a goal and a policy change at that point as opposed to just like a tweaking, right?
Yeah.
Because something like that was that crit or that like drastic would like really really quickly it feels like um change kind of how the market like function and operate, because obviously if oil corporations are no longer getting these subsidies to make them perhaps in the current time artificially competitive, which is kind of what it seems like it's going more in that direction, then they don't have the reason to switch what they're doing to make money with something else. Maybe they would almost overnight try to figure out how do we get into renewables, because that's now where the
Right.
if the subsidies were going down in
Pushing them.
that direction or whatever, maybe it would really change things. What did you think of the
Yeah, so it's just the reason why. So again, the sentence said most systems have evolved or are designed to stay far out of critical parameter ranges, which like basically like based on what we know about evolution makes sense, right? That systems that survive are going to be the ones that are more durable and more
more
robust.
robust? Yeah.
But then living in late stage capitalism or modernity, whatever you want to call this, it seems like our system is going into some critical parameter ranges. And given this is like, the system that we know and kind of like the global system, and it's like the one major system we have or whatever, it seems like, oh, well, the system we have, if most systems are designed to not go into critical parameter ranges, I don't know, but I guess even if we are in critical parameter ranges, the system probably will endure. It's just, some of the components of the system, some of the components being individuals,
Yeah.
groups of people within the system
Yeah.
may suffer or end up, being casualties of system change.
Well,
But
and
the
I'm
system
wondering,
itself, I guess, will endure, which kind of makes you question, like, what is the system? Is the system like the current, like the global economy, or is it like the global paradigm of capitalism is wonderful, the global paradigm of like neoliberalism? Like, what really is the system that would be preserved and isn't currently in a critical parameter range? I don't know. So systems are interesting. I don't know.
well, and I guess if like we were thinking like historically, like system collapses obviously have occurred, but they are somewhat, maybe infamous isn't the right word, but they are famous in a certain way because of the fact that they don't happen all the time.
Right. Yeah.
Like, like say like the collapse of the late Bronze Age, or like the fall of the Roman Empire, or the fall of the Mayans, or like we typically think of a lot of these systems, if we're thinking maybe in terms of like civilizations kind of here, like they oftentimes last like hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, and oftentimes what's required is some type of like external, whether that's economic pressure or like pressure from warfare, or some type of environmental like collapse or disaster, or some combination thereof. Oftentimes, right? Often it's the feedback loop of all these things kind of like coming crashing down at the same time is often what leads leads to like a true like collapse or whatever in the
And I
sense
think even
of like,
then you can kind of contest like whether the system has really collapsed, right? So like, when the Roman Empire collapsed, like, Rome didn't just dissolve into nothing, right? The people of Rome didn't just disappear. It was either subsumed into a larger system or changed form to not be as powerful. I guess like maybe a more modern analogy would be the British Empire, right? Which certainly like collapsed as an empire, but Great Britain's still there. It didn't go anywhere. So the system changed, and it's now part of a larger global economic system.
Yeah.
So what is the system that we're looking at? And when we think about most systems have evolved or are designed to stay out of critical parameter ranges, some systems are just subsystems of a larger system that is perhaps more robust and durable than like the smaller subsystems.
Well, and I guess like another way to think of it too would be like if we thought about humanity as a whole as being like the system. Right. Then like obviously there have been ebbs and flows across the sands of time everywhere, right? Like for a while these people were on the ascendancy, and probably that necessarily meant some other people were on the decline, and then that they sort of peaked and started going down, and somebody else kind of. So like I guess if we want to think on like the human level, I guess is like the system will survive in that respect,
right?
But obviously with potentially like significant downturns for significant parts of the right, like even back to like the collapse of the last or the late Bronze Age, like Egypt continued on, but they had a significant like decline in like standards of living and like materials they had access to, and so they sort of like lingered on, but definitely not at like the heights of their like former glory. And then obviously some civilizations, the Minoans and the Hittites and these various others, some of them like pretty much got consigned to the scrap heap of history, right? I mean, obviously some they probably got absorbed and subsumed into the next empire or whatever that came along or whatever. Like obviously the descendants of those peoples are probably still walking the earth today. It's just all been mixed up, and all the genetics are reconfigured, and all that, right? But there is a sense that there is a sense that um, there certainly can be like a very significant decline on a large scale. And while,
Right, right.
and I guess like my concern, if we were going to tie this to the modern era, obviously, that we were most concerned about because we were living in it, like, yeah, do we think like humans are going to like go extinct, with like climate crisis stuff piling up and perhaps global economy being less able
Right,
to deal
humans,
with
or
that?
the global biosphere, is that going to completely collapse? Probably not.
Yeah, but like, are we going to go to like some kind of Mad Max, future where water is scarce and perhaps, it's just unrealistic to sustain 8 billion people even anymore on the planet? Are there going to be massive die-offs? Like, is
Right, yeah.
civilization going to regress quite a bit from like where it currently is and could perhaps go if, you know, things did. I guess the question is like, it's like, oh, maybe a question of like degrees. Like, probably some human beings will still be here in 100, 200 years, but, you know, will they be able to like achieve a standard of living that like we have now again, or
Well, and
at least
that's,
for a
I
long
think, like
time?
something to keep in mind here, right? Is like we're thinking about this system from the framing of this article. We're thinking about it as something to be managed, right?
Yeah,
But the system, in many ways, many systems can be intentionally managed by humans, but most systems are just exist, right? Up to and perhaps including like quote unquote humanity or global civilization of humanity, whatever it is, right? We can certainly, as agents that believe they have free will, can intervene in the system, right? But no matter what, I mean, the system has parameters that we can't adjust. There are laws of nature, and there are conditions that we don't have power over. So
especially
we
as
can.
puny individuals.
Right, right, exactly. So we can make changes, but but the system will endure in some capacity. It's just, do we want it? Is it going to endure in the way that we want, right? And obviously, one of the higher up leverage points is goals of the system, and as components within the system, which all of us are, even the ones that are quote unquote managers of the system, the people that were in the room with Donella Meadows, figuring out the World Trade Organization, or the President of the United States, or President of Uganda, whatever. No matter which, or the CEO of BP Oil, no matter who you are or how much control you have in the system, no one is really like the puppeteer of the whole thing, right?
Oh,
We're
absolutely
all
not.
both
Yeah.
components, and maybe at some level have some influence over changes to the system, but we're also part of the material of the system. So there's kind of like this meta aspect, right? And no matter what, we want to try to change the system so that it better aligns with our goals, which our goals probably are, even if the system endures through climate change, through economic collapse, we want the people, I think we would say that we
Yeah.
want the people that are, within the system
To
to
thrive
endure as little suffering as possible and thrive as much as
as much
possible.
as
And
possible.
so
Yeah.
there are different changes that will be made to ensure that's the case, rather than if your only goal is the system continues to survive.
Or if your only goal is something like just profit, right? Like,
Right, maximize profits or something like that.
which
Yeah.
is when that's also the problem, I think, too, is that obviously goals is way down the list, but so much of this is defined by goals, like how you're gonna think to intervene in the system or what you're even going to try to offer as a solution is obviously going to be massively predicated on what your goal for the whole
Yeah.
system is. And so that's
Yep.
why it seems like ultimately like more effort should be put into those lower level ones that are going to have like more impact on the big changes as opposed to getting
Right,
too hung
or
up
higher
on,
level leverage
yeah,
points, but yeah,
on the
along the
nitty
list, yeah.
gritty. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So I think that kind of closes out our
Yeah.
discussion of constants, parameters, numbers. Again, kind of like the details, easy to change, but easy to unchange, right?
Yeah.
And kind of have lower level impact when you do change them.
And
So
seem
we
more
will.
like band-aid or surface level kind of things
Right, yeah,
oftentimes.
palliative, more superficial. Yep.
Yeah.
So the next level up is buffers and stabilizing stocks, and we'll do another video on that.
Do that in the video. All right.
Go.